The contract came with a ring and a warning. Veltharis of the Conclave's third diplomatic tier had negotiated 17 territorial disputes across 4 star systems, brokered the Kelhari silence, and once talked a Drikun warlord down from orbital bombardment using nothing but a secondary language she'd learned in 6 days. She was not a woman who frightened easily. But standing in the antechamber of the processing station above the third human world, reading the dossier on the mail they'd assigned her, she felt something uncomfortably close to dread. The photograph was the first thing. Humans rarely photographed well. Their bilateral symmetry was almost too perfect, their expressions too mobile, too quick, suggesting an interior life that shifted faster than any alien neurologist had yet mapped. This one was no different. He was lean in the way that suggested not genetics but a long time going without. His jaw carried a scar she'd been told was from a broken bottle in a transit port brawl when he was 19, which he'd reportedly won. His eyes, gray-green in the human color spectrum, were looking not at the camera but slightly past it, at something the photographer couldn't see. His name was Marcus Vale, no relation, which she'd confirmed twice, and he was 34 years old, a former staff sergeant in the Human Coalition's Peripheral Defense Forces, discharged honorably after the Vega Station incident, classified. He had no living family. He was fluent in 3 human languages, passable in 2 Conclave trade dialects, and according to the behavioral assessment filed by Conclave Intelligence, he exhibited anomalous threat profile compression, which was analyst speak for the fact that the more dangerous a situation became, the calmer he got. The warning was on the last page. A single line, flagged in the Conclave's deep red. Subject has previously neutralized 4 Conclave security operatives, 3 Drikun enforcement units, and 1 situation that our models suggest should have required a battalion. Method in the last case, unclear. She closed the dossier. The marriage was not her idea. It was the Conclave's. Specifically, it was the compromise position extracted from 18 months of deadlocked negotiations between the Conclave Expansion Authority and the newly unified Human Coalition. The humans had done something no species had managed in the Conclave's 400-year history. They'd said no, not to a specific demand, to the entire framework. They'd looked at the Conclave's offer of protected status, a legal category that provided security guarantees, trade access, and only the most reasonable expectations of compliance with Conclave doctrine. And they'd said, collectively, with the kind of unanimity that baffled every xenopolitical analyst the Conclave employed, absolutely not. The Conclave had then attempted to explain what happened to species that refused protected status. The humans had listened carefully and said they understood, and they'd like to discuss it further. And also they'd been spending the last 3 years quietly mining the asteroid belt between their 3rd and 4th planets, and they now had enough kinetic kill platforms in solar orbit to make any initial invasion force economically inadvisable. They said this last part pleasantly. The Conclave had called an emergency session. The compromise that emerged from that session, after 6 weeks of argument that had, by all accounts, gotten theological at several points, was the bonding provision. 1 human, 1 Conclave diplomat, a legal marriage under both jurisdictions, which created a formal link, a living treaty, a symbol of what the architects of the provision called integrated trust building. It was, Vale had thought when she'd first read the mandate, the most elaborate way anyone had ever tried to put a leash on something they were afraid of. She was to be the leash. She was also, the mandate noted gently, to report quarterly on her husband's activities, his social connections, his emotional state, and any information that might be relevant to the Conclave's ongoing assessment of human threat potential. She had accepted the assignment. She was a professional. The ceremony was short. A Conclave magistrate, a human civil registrar, a room with fluorescent lighting that buzzed slightly on a frequency Vale found irritating, Marcus Vale arrived on time, which she noted. He was wearing the closest thing to formal clothing his culture demanded, dark fabric, fitted, and when he walked in, he scanned the room in a way that was so automatic he probably didn't know he was doing it. Exit points, she realized. He was cataloging exit points. He looked at her for a long moment. She was, she knew, physically striking by conclave standards. The iridescent undertones of her skin shifted with her mood, and her secondary eyes, the ones set above the primary pair that most humans found disturbing, were currently closed, which was as much accommodation as she decided to offer. He said, "You're taller than I expected." She said, "You're shorter than your file suggested." He thought about that for a second. Then he smiled, a small thing, one corner of his mouth only, gone almost before it arrived, and he held out his hand in the human greeting posture. "Marcus," he said. "Vale," she said, and took it. His grip was careful, she noticed that too. They were assigned a habitat module on the diplomatic ring of Conclave Station 7, which orbited the fourth moon of the human's third planet. It was a reasonable space, 3 rooms, a common area, a viewport that looked out over the moon's gray-brown surface. Vale had lived in smaller places during longer postings. Marcus moved his things in with the efficiency of someone who had moved often and owned very little. A bag. A case for equipment she didn't ask about. A small metal object that he set on the shelf beside the viewport, and which she later identified as a compass, antique, needle-based, useless in space, carried anyway. The first week was an education in cohabitation with a human. He drank something called coffee at a frequency that seemed medically inadvisable. He hummed while he did things, not songs she recognized, fragments that started and stopped, improvised around whatever he was focused on. He slept less than she'd expected and woke without apparent transition, as though the boundary between sleep and readiness was a line he'd worn away. He was unfailingly polite in a way that was not warmth. It was a kind of structural courtesy, maintained without effort, like good posture. He did not ask her about her work. She did not ask about his. What she filed in her first report was accurate as far as it went. He had made contact with 3 other humans on the station, 2 former military, 1 civilian contractor. He had explored the full extent of the diplomatic ring within 48 hours, including 2 maintenance corridors and 1 section that was technically restricted. When she'd mentioned, carefully, that the restricted section was off-limits, he'd looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "The locking mechanism on that door has been failing intermittently for 6 months. Someone should fix it." She'd asked how he knew. He'd said the dust pattern on the threshold was wrong. He noticed things. That was the most precise way she could phrase it. He noticed things the way other beings breathed, automatically, constantly, without apparent effort or intent. She had spent her career reading rooms and people, and she was good at it, and she found by the end of the second week that he was better. She did not include this in the report. The first time she saw him fight, she wasn't supposed to be watching. It was the 11th week. A delegation of Drekun merchants had arrived on Station 7 to negotiate a shipping contract, and with them had come, as Drekun delegations invariably did, their private security detail. The Drekun were large, 3 meters on average, with redundant skeletal structures that made them difficult to incapacitate, and a social structure in which casual violence was both common and unremarkable. Their security detail were the larger specimens, selected for the specific purpose of making other beings feel unsafe. There had been an incident in the transit corridor near the commissary. Vale heard about it secondhand from a Kalhari station worker who'd witnessed it, and then she pulled the corridor footage, and then she watched it twice. 2 of the Drekun security personnel, each outmassing Marcus by a factor that the station's gravity sensors had registered, had decided, for reasons the footage didn't capture, to make a point about human frailty to a nearby audience of station residents. They had positioned themselves in the corridor in a way that made passage impossible, and were delivering the kind of commentary that the Dracon considered friendly intimidation, and everyone else considered a prelude to hospitalization. Marcus had been walking back from the commissary, carrying a container of coffee. She watched him register the situation. It took him perhaps half a second. She watched him decide something, she couldn't read what, but the small shift in how he held himself was visible if you knew to look for it. And then he walked directly toward the Dracon, not around them. He said something she couldn't hear on the footage. One of the Dracon reached for him. What happened in the next 8 seconds was difficult to parse even watching it 3 times at reduced speed. He moved like he had information about where everything was going to be before it got there. He used the corridor wall, the Dracon's own momentum, a structural handhold she wouldn't have thought to notice, and the second Dracon's apparent certainty that the situation didn't require his attention yet. He was still holding the coffee container when it was over. He hadn't spilled any. He helped the first Dracon up. He said something else she couldn't hear. The Dracon stared at him. He walked on down the corridor. She closed the footage. In her report that week, she wrote, "Subject continues to acclimate to station environment without incident." They began, by some process she couldn't precisely identify, to talk. It started as functional exchange, schedules, the occasional shared meal when their timing coincided, the brief negotiations of shared space that cohabitation required. Then it became something else, incrementally, in the way that all slow changes happen unnoticeably, until it was already done. He asked her once during a meal what she'd studied before the diplomatic corps. She told him xenolinguistics, with a secondary focus on conflict semiotics, the way hostility encoded itself into language before it became action. He'd nodded slowly, turning that over. Then he said that in basic training they'd had a 2-week module on de-escalation, and the instructor had told them the most important thing wasn't the words. It was the 3 seconds before the words, when both parties were still deciding what kind of moment this was going to be. She had looked at him across the table and felt something rearrange itself quietly behind her sternum. She asked him once about the Vega Station incident, the classified one. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, but honest, and then he said that there had been 31 non-combatants on that station, and a conclave enforcement unit had been given orders that would have resulted in casualties, and he decided that someone needed to make those orders unworkable before they could be carried out. She asked what he'd done. He said mildly that he'd had a conversation with the enforcement unit's command structure that had been fairly persuasive. She said, "The report says 4 conclave operatives were neutralized." He said, "I define neutralized differently than your analysts do. They all went home." She filed this in a separate, private place that was not her report. The things she did not write in her reports accumulated slowly. The compass on the shelf, and the story he'd told about it, his grandfather, a man who'd navigated by stars and handed the compass to his son, who'd given it to Marcus before he shipped out, saying that knowing where north was mattered even when north wasn't where you needed to go. The particular way he laughed, rare, genuine, a sound like something unexpected being welcomed. The fact that he had, on 2 occasions, fixed things on the station that were broken, not because anyone asked, but because they were broken and he'd noticed. The fact that when she came back from a difficult negotiation late one evening, he had left coffee on the counter with a note that said only, "Good or bad." She'd looked at the note for a long moment. Then she'd written back, "Difficult." When she woke, there was a second note under the first one. "Those are the ones that count." The message from the conclave came in the 4th month. It was marked second priority, which was the classification that meant it wasn't urgent but required a response within 48 hours, and it came from Director Asheville of Intelligence Integration, who was Vale's superior, and who did not, in the ordinary course of things, communicate directly with field diplomats. The message said, Assessment of subject's military value has been upgraded. Ongoing intelligence from peripheral sectors suggests human resistance to conclave authority is more structured than previously understood. You are directed to expand information gathering to include tactical assessments, network mapping, and any communications the subject maintains with human military contacts. Additionally, the bonding provision architects request your assessment of whether the subject could be leveraged, in the diplomatic sense, toward encouraging human compliance. She read the message 3 times. She understood what it meant. She had always understood what it meant. She was not naive, had never been naive, had known from the beginning what the assignment was. She was the leash. The reporting was the point. The marriage was a mechanism. She knew all of this. She wrote back, acknowledged, "I will continue to file regular reports." She did not expand her information gathering. She told herself she was waiting for a better strategic moment. She did not examine this closely. The crisis arrived, as crises tended to, without warning and at an inconvenient hour. The Conclave's 7th expansion fleet had moved into the border system that the humans called New Providence, a colony of approximately 12,000, mostly families, mostly civilian, on a planet that the Conclave's resource assessment teams had decided was worth the political friction of acquiring. The official position was that the fleet was conducting a survey. The unofficial reality, which Vale knew from 17 years of diplomatic service, was that a survey conducted by the 7th Expansion Fleet was what preceded a formal claim, which preceded a relocation directive, which preceded whatever the humans might do about it. What the humans did, it turned out, was send Marcus. She didn't know immediately. He received a communication. She knew he'd received it. The station's signal log showed the incoming packet, encrypted on human military protocols she didn't have keys for. He'd been at the viewport when it came, looking out at the moon's surface with the particular stillness that she'd come to understand wasn't emptiness but concentration. He'd read it, stood up, and gone to where he kept his equipment case. She stood in the doorway of the common room. "What is it?" He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not fear, not anger, something more precise, the expression of a person looking at a situation they understand completely. He said, "They're going to take New Providence." She said, "The survey is." Vale, his voice was even not unkind. "You know what the survey is." She was quiet. He said, "There are 12,000 people on that planet. Mostly kids, actually. The colony went up 8 years ago as a family resettlement program." He was checking something in the equipment case as he spoke, hands moving with the automatic economy of long practice. "The fleet is going to give them a relocation directive they can't possibly comply within the window they'll be given, and then they're going to proceed." "The Conclave does not," she began. "The Conclave has done it 17 times in the last century," he said. "I've read the history." She did not dispute this. She couldn't. He closed the case. He picked up the compass from the shelf. She'd never seen him touch it before, just keep it, and he held it for a moment, looking at it, and then he put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at her, and his face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she still didn't have the vocabulary for. He said, "I have to go." She said, "The Conclave will." "I know what the Conclave will do," still even, still not unkind. "I know what it means that I'm going, I know what it costs." He looked at her for another moment. "I'm sorry, I know this is your assignment and I know what you're supposed to do with what you see." The word assignment landed in her chest like something sharp. She said, "I have never," and stopped. He waited. She said, "I don't know what I am to you." He said quietly, "I think you know." And then he walked out, and she stood in the doorway of the common room with the moon gray and still in the viewport. And she thought about the first note and the second note, and the coffee and the compass, and the 17 incidents of Conclave fleet activity against civilian populations in a century, and her director's message asking her to leverage him and the way he laughed, and what it cost to hold something you weren't supposed to hold, and she stood there for a long time. Then she sent a message. Not to Director Asheville, to a colleague on the New Providence Colonial Communication Relay. She marked it routine. She said, tell them what's coming, give them the timeline, give them everything. Then she sat down and waited to see what Marcus Vale would do. What he did was not what anyone, and a lot of people it turned out, were watching expected. The 7th Expansion Fleet arrived at New Providence with 12 vessels, 4 heavy cruisers, 6 midline enforcement ships, 2 command support frigates. By any standard of interstellar military mathematics, this was not a force that anticipated significant resistance. New Providence had no standing military. The human coalition's nearest naval response capability was 18 hours away at best speed. The fleet's commander, a bureaucrat admiral named Thesivar who had overseen 6 previous resource acquisitions and regarded them as logistical exercises, broadcast the standard relocation directive and settled in to wait. Marcus arrived in a civilian freight hauler he had apparently borrowed from a contact at the station, which had taken him 11 hours to get to the system, and which was, by any metric, the least threatening vessel in 3 sectors. He broadcast on the fleet's command frequency. He identified himself as Staff Sergeant Marcus Vale, Human Coalition Peripheral Defense Forces, retired. He said he'd like to have a conversation before anything else happened. Thesivar, by all subsequent accounts, found this mildly amusing. He agreed to the conversation. He had 12 warships. What happened over the next 4 hours was reconstructed afterward from fleet communication logs, independent sensor buoys, and the accounts of approximately 60 witnesses on New Providence who had access to the open communication channels. Marcus talked. He talked for a long time, and what he said, Vale understood later when she read the transcripts, was not a negotiation in any conventional sense. It wasn't a demand or a threat or a set of conditions. It was something harder to categorize. He talked about the 17 previous fleet acquisitions and what had happened to the populations that had been relocated, the mortality rates in the first transition years, the cultural dissolution rates, the economic data. He talked about New Providence specifically, the names of some of the families there, the school that had been built 2 years ago, the water reclamation project that had taken 4 years of collective labor to complete. He talked about what the Conclave's own charter said about sovereign populations and minimum viable timelines, and the specific regulation under which the relocation directive was non-compliant, and who in the Conclave's legal structure had the authority to flag that non-compliance. He was not angry. He was not frightened. He was, Vale thought, reading the transcript and recognizing that particular quality, doing what he had described to her once, occupying the 3 seconds before the moment, when both parties were still deciding what kind of moment it was going to be. Thesivar, by hour 2, had stopped being amused. By hour 3, 3 of the enforcement ship captains had entered standing orders to delay action pending review, a procedural option rarely used, technically available, requiring only a formal objection from a flag-ranked officer and 2 witnesses, which Marcus apparently knew cold. By hour 4, the fleet was in a procedural hold that would require, at minimum, 6 weeks of legal review to unwind. Thesivar then made a decision that Vale thought, later, said everything about how the Conclave had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. He sent 2 enforcement ships to board the freight hauler and detain Marcus. She heard about this part from the sensor buoy data. The 2 enforcement ships matched velocity with the hauler. They deployed boarding teams, 12 personnel each, standard Conclave enforcement configuration. The boarding teams boarded. 20 minutes later, the enforcement ships withdrew. Sensor buoys logged the departure of the freight hauler from the system at a heading that was, technically, away from New Providence, which satisfied the nominal conditions of the procedural hold. What the boarding teams reported internally in a document that was supposed to be classified, but which leaked with the particular inevitability of things that should never have been written down, was that they had encountered the human and determined that proceeding with the detention was tactically inadvisable. One team leader noted that the human had not, at any point, raised his voice or used threatening language, and had in fact offered them coffee from a small maker he apparently traveled with, and that this had somehow made the entire situation more unsettling rather than less. Another noted that after 5 minutes of conversation, 2 members of her team had begun voluntarily questioning their orders, and she had made a command decision to remove them from the situation before the effect spread. The document noted, in conclusion, subject exhibited anomalous threat profile compression, recommend formal threat assessment upgrade. The conclave had written that phrase about him once before. It had been filed as curiosity. Now it was something else. The 7th Expansion Fleet withdrew from New Providence 6 days later, pending legal review. Vale was called before the director. She sat across from Director Asheville in the holographic chamber on Station 7, the director's projection crisp and cold, her expression carrying the specific quality of a person who has confirmed a suspicion they'd hoped to disprove. Asheville said, "The message to the New Providence relay." Vale said, "Yes." Asheville said, "You understand what you've done." "I understand it clearly," Vale said. There was a pause. Asheville said, "We have analysts who spent 9 months on the question of whether your husband represents a threat to conclave interests. I want your assessment, as his closest contact." Vale thought about the coffee note. She thought about the compass. She thought about the boarding team report and the 3 seconds before the moment and the way he'd looked at her in the doorway when he said, "I think you know." She said, "He isn't a threat to the conclave." Asheville's expression was sharp. "He is a threat to what the conclave does when it thinks no one is watching," Vale said. "That is a different thing. And I think, with respect, that conflating them is how you get boarding teams withdrawing from freight haulers." Silence. "He doesn't want to destroy the conclave," she said. "He wants it to behave like it says it does. And he is very patient, and he notices things, and he is better at the 3 seconds before the moment than anyone I've encountered in 17 years of diplomacy. If you send an army, he won't fight the army. He'll talk to the army until the army starts wondering why it's there. That is not a problem you can solve with more army." She waited. Asheville said finally, "The conclave does not withdraw." "The fleet withdrew from New Providence," Vale said. Another silence, longer. "What would you recommend?" Asheville said, and the phrasing was careful enough that Vale recognized it as something she hadn't expected, a genuine question. "Direct engagement," Vale said. "Real engagement, not monitoring. He told me once that the 3 seconds before the moment are when both parties decide what kind of moment it's going to be. The conclave has been deciding for the humans. That's the problem." She paused. "Let them decide," she said. "You might be surprised what they decide." Marcus was in the common room when she got back. He was sitting by the viewport with coffee, and the moon was turning slowly below them, and he was doing the thing he did where he watched it without appearing to watch it, present, attentive, not performing either of those things. He looked up when she came in. Read her face the way he always read faces, efficiently and completely. He said, "How bad?" She said, "I've been formally censured. My clearance is under review. There will likely be disciplinary proceedings." She sat down across from him. "I told them what I told you in the doorway, that I don't know what I am to you." He was quiet for a moment. "What did they say?" he said. "They asked what I recommended." She looked at him. "I told them the truth." He looked out at the moon. She watched his face. He had an expression she had no word for in any language she spoke, not relief, not vindication, Something more quiet and more complicated, like a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has set it down somewhere, and is deciding whether to pick it up again. He said, "What do you want, Vale?" The question was simple. She had been asked complex questions for 17 years and answered them with the skill of someone who understood that the real answer was usually not the one being sought. This question was different. This question meant exactly what it said. She said, "I want to know what kind of moment this is." He looked at her. One corner of his mouth moved. He said, "I think that's up to us." The conclave did not dismantle the bonding provision. They were not, as it turned out, in a position to. Because Marcus had filed the non-compliance citation with the conclave's own legal framework, formally, correctly, with the exact documentation required, the New Providence case went through review. It took 11 weeks. The legal review found the relocation directive deficient on 3 counts. The fleet action was formally designated irregular. Thesavar was reassigned to a mapping survey in an outer system. This was not, in itself, a major victory. The conclave was large and old and had many fleets. One irregular designation did not change a 400-year history of doing as it pleased with the species it encountered. But it was something that had not happened before, and the humans who had been watching noted it. And certain people within the conclave who had been watching the humans noted that they noted it. Vale's disciplinary proceedings resulted in a formal reprimand and reassignment to the Diplomatic Integration Office, a posting that was, technically, a demotion, but which happened also to be the office responsible for managing the bonding provision, which meant she remained exactly where she was. She filed this observation privately and did not share it with Asheville, who she suspected already knew. The second fleet action came 8 months later. It was a different fleet, a different system, a small human outpost near the transit corridor called Waypoint Dusk, population 600, mostly researchers. The fleet this time was the conclave's second rapid response group, smaller than the 7th but faster, commanded by an admiral who had read the Vega Station file and the New Providence report and the anomalous threat profile assessments, and had decided, Vale thought, that the problem was that Thesavar had engaged at all. The plan, she understood when she saw the deployment orders she was not supposed to see, was to move quickly. No communication, no relocation directive, just force majeure, a done thing before anyone could object or file citations or show up in freight haulers to have conversations. Marcus received a communication and was on his feet in the same motion, and this time she didn't stand in the doorway. She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "I've already sent what they need to start a formal injunction. It won't hold them long, but there's something else." She pulled up the deployment orders on the common room display, orders she shouldn't have had, from a source she wasn't going to explain. He studied them. She watched his eyes move across the data, cataloging, mapping, the same process she'd seen in the transit corridor footage except directed now at a tactical display. 3 seconds, 5, 10. He said, "The command ship is the Valekassan." "Yes." "The commander is Drath Savin." "Yes." "I know Drath Savin," he said. She looked at him. He said, "She sat next to me in the second hour of the New Providence negotiation. She'd been reassigned to the second fleet from Thesavar's group. She filed 2 of the standing delay orders." He paused. "She sent me a message 6 months ago. Diplomatic channel, encrypted on her personal code. I didn't respond." "What did it say?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his face had the complicated quality she'd finally, after months, found a word for. Not in any language she'd been trained in. A word she'd made herself from pieces of several because she'd needed it and it hadn't existed. Valesorin, which meant approximately the expression of a person who has understood something important and is deciding whether it is worth the cost. He said, "She asked me what it would take." Vale was still. Not surrender, he said. Not compliance. She asked what it would take for the conclave to earn actual trust from humans, not compelled acceptance, actual trust. He looked out the viewport. I didn't answer because I didn't know if it was genuine. Is it? Yes, he said. I was 93% sure 6 months ago. After Waypoint Dusk, I'm certain. She thought about what Asheville had asked her, and what she'd answered, and a long thread connected across the months. She said, what would it take? He looked at her. He said, someone to talk to. He went to Waypoint Dusk, but not the way anyone expected. He didn't go in the freight hauler. He went as a formal diplomatic representative, because Vale had spent 48 hours filing the credentials, calling in the last of her standing markers, and extracting from the bonding provision framework a technical interpretation that gave her husband provisional diplomatic status in active conclave operational zones. The legal department was still arguing about whether this was valid when he boarded a proper diplomatic shuttle. He arrived at Waypoint Dusk 12 hours before the Second Fleet. He contacted Admiral Drathsavin on her personal encrypted channel. He said, here's what it would take, and he talked for 2 hours, and this time there was no freight hauler, there was no procedural maneuver, there was no citation or delay order. There was just the conversation, the 3 seconds before the moment sustained across hours, 2 people deciding together what kind of moment it was going to be. The Second Fleet arrived and held position. Drathsavin broadcast on the open command channel that she was requesting a full legal review of the Waypoint Dusk operational orders before proceeding. She cited the New Providence precedent. She cited the Conclave Charter. She cited 3 regulations that Marcus had identified in their conversation that nobody had used in 60 years. The fleet held. Waypoint Dusk remained. Vale was sitting in the diplomatic integration office, working through the implications of a case file she'd been handed that morning, when the message from Asheville came. It said, the Strategic Council wants to meet with your husband. She read it twice. She sent back, under what terms? The answer came in 4 minutes, his terms. Whatever they are, get them. She sat with this for a while. Then she calmed Marcus, who was somewhere on the station. She could hear faintly that he was in the station commissary, and there was the distant familiar sound of him getting coffee. She said, the Strategic Council wants to meet with you. A pause, then all of them. That's what the message implies. Another pause. She heard him set down something ceramic. He said, okay. She said, what are your terms? He said, no terms. Tell them I'll be there. Tell them to bring anyone they want, and tell them I want a pot of coffee in the room and a window because I think better with a view. A pause. And tell them it's not a negotiation. Tell them it's a conversation. There's a difference. She looked at the viewport, at the moon, gray and patient below. She said, Marcus. Yeah. Bring the compass. A silence longer. She could hear him breathing. He said quietly, already in my pocket. She did not attend the Strategic Council meeting. She wasn't invited, and she didn't ask to be, and she understood that this was appropriate. This was his, not hers, and there was a difference between the thing she'd done, which was decide, and the thing he was going to do, which was be precisely who he was in a room full of people who had never encountered that before. She waited in the integration office for 6 hours. What she knew afterward came from 3 sources. A council secretary's informal report that was technically confidential but which had, in the way of these things, made its way to several people's desks. The body language of 2 council members she passed in the corridor on her way home, and Marcus himself later. The informal report noted that the meeting had lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was approximately 3 hours longer than Strategic Council meetings typically ran, and that the Council had requested twice that it be extended. It noted that the human representative had spoken for perhaps a third of the total time, and that the remainder had been questions, genuine questions, not the adversarial informational exchange of conclave political discourse, but actual inquiry, the council leaning forward. It noted that at the 2-hour mark, when Council Elder Theshan had asked the human what he wanted from the conclave, the human had said, "What you said you were, the first time." Then the silence in the room had apparently lasted long enough to be notable, even in a room of beings accustomed to long silences. The council members she passed in the corridor were quiet. One of them looked at her and then looked away, and the look was not hostile or cold. It was the look of a person who had understood something and was sitting with it. The second one paused and said only, "He's very patient," then walked on. Marcus was in the common room when she got back, sitting by the viewport, coffee, moon, the particular stillness that was not emptiness. He looked up, read her face. She said, "What happened?" He said, "A conversation." He looked back at the moon, a real one, maybe the first one. He was quiet for a moment. They asked what humans want. I told them we mostly want to be left alone and occasionally left together, and we want our kids to grow up to make choices we couldn't predict. I said it wasn't more complicated than that. He paused. I don't think they believed me at first. They're used to wanting being more complicated. She sat down across from him. Close this time. The way she'd been sitting since somewhere around month 3 without deciding to. She said, "Did it work?" He said, "We'll see." He looked at her. That's the honest answer. It's always the honest answer. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the compass, set it on the table between them, facing up, needle pointing at whatever passed for north on a rotating station. What I know is that 4 hours ago, there were 9 council elders who had a file on me and thought they knew what I was. I think some of them maybe understand something different now. Maybe enough of them. She looked at the compass, thought about his grandfather, the man who'd navigated by stars, who'd given it to his son, who'd given it to this man, who'd carried it across space and into wormhole negotiations and freight hauler boardings, and 4 hours of conversation with the governing body of a 400-year empire. She said, "They'll come back, the fleets, the directives, it won't be solved by one conversation." He said, "No." She said, "And the bonding provision is still a mechanism. My assignment is still." He said, "Vale." She stopped. He said, "What did you do the day I left for New Providence, before you knew what would happen, before you could know?" She said, "I sent the message." He said, "Yeah." He picked up his coffee. "That's who you are. That's been who you are since before we figured out that we liked each other." He looked at her steadily. "Mechanisms don't do that. Assignments don't do that. You did that." She was quiet. Outside the viewport, the moon turned. Below them, 12,000 people on a planet that still existed were sleeping in houses they'd built, in a colony that was still standing because of a freight hauler and 4 hours of conversation, and a woman who'd sent a message before she knew if it would matter. She said, "I want to come with you, next time. Whatever next time is." He looked at her for a moment, the complicated expression, Valesoren, the word she'd built from pieces. He said, "You realize what that means. Asheville, the proceedings, they'll call it." "I know what they'll call it," she said. He said, "It means you're choosing." She said, "I know." He was quiet, then the small smile, one corner gone almost before it arrived, the real one. He said, "Then come." She did. The third incident was a surveying operation in the Outer Harrow, 2 conclave extraction ships, and a security detail. A small human settlement of 200, a dispute about mineral rights that had been filed by both sides and which the conclave had decided, unilaterally, to resolve. The human coalition filed a protest. The conclave acknowledged receipt. Marcus and Vale arrived in a diplomatic shuttle, with credentials, with the legal filings already running in parallel, and with a communication request sent to every captain of every conclave vessel in the system, marked personal and addressed by name. She watched him work. She had studied conflict for 17 years. She had brokered 17 disputes. She understood with precision the architecture of confrontation, the moves and countermoves, the face-saving mechanisms, the careful choreography of parties preserving enough dignity to accept outcomes they'd previously refused. She was good at it. He was different. He didn't work in architecture. He worked in weather. He created conditions, and he waited, and he paid attention, and he understood in some way she was still mapping, still finding vocabulary for that people very rarely actually wanted to do the things they were preparing to do. They wanted a reason not to. They wanted someone to make the choice not to feel like capitulation. He gave them that. He gave them consistently, with extraordinary patience, the experience of deciding for themselves. The extraction ships held. The mineral rights dispute went to formal arbitration, which the conclave's legal framework mandated as the alternative to unilateral resolution. The settlement's 200 people watched from the surface as ships that had come to displace them changed their orbital patterns and stayed. On the way back, she sat beside him in the shuttle, and outside the viewport the star field was enormous and cold and full of things that were happening, and would happen, and could not all be prevented or persuaded. She said, "It's not enough." He said, "Not yet." She said, "The conclave is old and it moves slowly, and there will be more fleets and more directives, and there will be a day when a conversation doesn't work, and someone makes a choice that." He said, "Yeah." She said, "You're not afraid of that day." He said, "I'm afraid of it every time I go to sleep." He was looking at the stars. "I've been afraid of it since before I knew your name, before any of this." He paused. "Being afraid of it doesn't mean it wins. It means I know what's at stake." A pause. That's the thing about humans that nobody ever seems to get. We don't do this because we're not scared. We do it because we decided something else matters more. He looked at her. "You made that choice. On the day I went a new Providence. You knew the cost and you sent the message anyway." She thought about the note under the note. "Those are the ones that count." She said, "Difficult." He looked at her, understanding immediately, as he always did. He said, "Those are the ones that count." The Strategic Council met again 3 months later. This time, Vale was in the room. She sat beside Marcus, in a chamber she'd been in dozens of times for dozens of negotiations, and she watched the most powerful governing body in 7 star systems ask questions they genuinely did not know the answer to, and she watched her husband answer them with the specific quality of patience that was not resignation but decision. The choice, made fresh each time, to believe that the 3 seconds before the moment still existed, that the moment hadn't been decided yet, that both parties were still choosing. The council elder Theshan asked her, directly, what the Diplomatic Integration Office's recommendation was going forward. She said, "Direct engagement, genuine engagement. Allow the humans to participate in the legal revision of conclave expansion doctrine, not as a courtesy. As co-architects," she looked around the room, "they're not going to go away, they're not going to accept protected status, they're not going to stop noticing things." She looked at Marcus. "You don't contain what they are, you work with it." The silence was long. Then Theshan said, with the careful quality of a very old person who has learned to change their mind slowly enough that it doesn't break anything, "What would that look like?" It was not a question, it was an invitation. Marcus leaned forward. He said, "Let me tell you about New Providence. There's a school there, someone built it. I want to tell you about the people who built it." And he began. Outside the chamber's viewport, the stars were doing what stars had always done, burning and turning, indifferent and ancient, in the enormous dark that humanity had walked out into without permission and without armor, armed only with the specific stubbornness of beings who had looked at every reason not to, and decided that wasn't the point. The compass was in his pocket. North was where it had always been. The conversation continued. The work was slow. It was supposed to be slow. The conclave had not built 400 years of structure in a decade, and it would not revise it in one. And Marcus understood this the way he understood most things, fully, without complaint, as a condition of the problem rather than an obstacle to the solution. What changed incrementally. The legal working group that the Strategic Council authorized, tentatively, with extensive caveats, was small at first. 3 conclave legal architects, 2 human coalition representatives, 1 independent from the Kalahari who had been watching the whole sequence with the particular attention of a species that had been through protected status twice and had opinions. Vale was assigned as the conclave liaison, which suited no one's comfort and suited the situation exactly. Marcus was not on the working group. He was available, occasionally, to the working group. When a question arose that was specifically his, which happened more often than anyone expected, because the questions that were specifically his tended to be the ones where the legal architecture had developed a blind spot from never having anyone inside it who could see the blind spot. He came to those sessions the way he came to most things. On time, with coffee, with the patience of someone who understood that the room deciding for itself was the whole point. Vale watched him, across these months, in the particular way that a person watches something they are still learning to name. She had been watching him since the corridor footage, and she had watched him differently since the doorway conversation, and differently again since she sat beside him in the Strategic Council chamber. Each iteration was more complete than the last, not because he changed, but because she kept finding more of what had always been there. He had a habit, when the working group sessions ran long, of asking questions that seemed tangential. She'd clocked it during the 3rd session, when the legal architects were arguing about notification timelines for survey operations near inhabited systems, a technical debate that was genuinely complex, and Marcus had waded through 40 minutes of it, and then asked, quietly, whether anyone had spoken to a settlement resident about what the experience of a survey notification felt like to receive. The room had gone slightly still. The answer was no. He'd said, "I know a woman on New Providence whose daughter was 4 years old when the fleet came. I'd like to tell you what the notification process looked like from her doorstep, if that's useful. It took 12 minutes. By the end of it, the timeline debate had reoriented entirely." He did this consistently. Not manipulatively, she'd considered whether it was strategic, had turned it over the way she turned most things over, and landed on the answer that it wasn't strategy, it was just a different frame. He looked at legal architecture and saw the people it was built around, or failing to be built around, and he said so, plainly, without drama. He hummed while he read the draft documents. He fixed the broken coffee dispenser in the working group anteroom. He helped a junior conclave legal aide find a precedent that had been misfiled in the archives. Helped, meaning spent an afternoon doing it, not meaning delegated. And the aide had looked at him afterward with an expression that Vale recognized as the beginning of being changed by an encounter. This was the thing about him that she had most difficulty explaining when Asheville's successor, a woman named Drev, less adversarial than her predecessor but equally precise, asked for her quarterly assessment. The difficulty was that what he did wasn't dramatic. The dramatic events, the freight hauler, the boarding teams, the Strategic Council session, were real and they mattered, but they were the surface. The actual work was the long accumulation of small moments in which the humans became, incrementally, less alien to the people who governed the galaxy, and the conclave became, incrementally, less alien to the humans who'd refused it. And this happened because a man with a compass and a coffee habit paid close attention, and was patient and decided freshly, every single day, that the 3 seconds before the moment were worth showing up for. She wrote in her assessment, "Subject continues to represent the highest value diplomatic asset the bonding provision has produced. Recommend continued engagement." She paused. Then she added, For the record, I am aware that this assessment is no longer objective. I have elected to file it anyway. Drev's response came back in 4 hours. It said, "Noted, please continue." She found Marcus in the common room afterward, doing the thing he did with the viewport and the moon, and she sat beside him and told him about the message, and he read her face and then looked back at the moon and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You know what I've been thinking about?" She said, "Tell me." He said, "My grandfather used to say that the compass doesn't tell you where to go. It tells you which way is north. You still have to decide where you're going." He had the compass in his hand, not moving, just the weight of it. I spent a long time thinking that was about navigation, like it was advice for getting unlost. He turned the compass over, but I think he meant it was about knowing your own position. Not where you're going, where you are, so you can make a real choice instead of just moving. She looked at the compass, at the needle doing what needles did, finding the thing it was built to find, regardless of circumstance. She said, "And where are you?" He looked at her, the complicated expression she'd built a word for, and then it resolved into something simpler, quieter, the expression beneath it that she hadn't had a word for until recently and now had the only word she needed. He said, "Here." Outside the viewport, the moon turned in its patient circle. Below it, on the planet it orbited, 12,000 people were going about the ordinary geography of their lives, not because a fleet had been defeated, not because an army had been crushed by a single soldier, but because a series of conversations had taken place, carefully, over months and years, between beings who were learning, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous difficulty, to decide together what kind of moment the next one was going to be. This was, she had come to understand, the human thing, not the freight hauler, not the boarding team, not the strategic council session, impressive as all of those were. The human thing was the long decision, made again every morning, to treat the 3 seconds before the moment as a place worth living in, to hold the conversation open, to carry the compass not because it told you where you were going, but because it told you where you were, which was the beginning of everything. She had spent 17 years in diplomacy, believing that power was the mechanism and language was the tool, and the outcome was what justified the method. She believed something more complicated now. She believed, with the specific certainty of a person who has watched something work, that there was a kind of strength that didn't look like strength from the outside, that registered on no tactical display, that no boarding team assessment had vocabulary for, the strength of a person who had decided what mattered and then showed up for it. Every day, without armor, without drama, carrying coffee and a compass, and the patience of someone who understood that the moment wasn't over yet. She leaned against his shoulder. He didn't move. The moon turned. She said, "What do we do tomorrow?" He said, "Show up." A pause. "Probably fix whatever's broken. There's always something broken." She said, "And if the fleets come again?" He said, "They will." He was quiet. "And we'll be there." Outside, the stars were doing what stars had always done, enormous and indifferent and full of other stories, other species, other moments still deciding what they were going to be. The compass pointed north. The coffee went cold and neither of them moved to warm it. This was the thing the conclave's analysts had never found a category for. Not anomalous threat profile compression, not tactical asymmetry, not even the particular quality of the 3 seconds before the moment, though that came closest. What they didn't have a category for was love. Not the treaty variety, not the mechanism variety, but the kind that exists in notes left under notes and compasses carried in pockets, and the decision, made in doorways and shuttle seats and legal working groups and the quiet of viewports in the middle of cycles that passed for night, to be where you were, with who you were with, because you chose it. The conclave would not solve this problem. They would eventually understand they weren't supposed to. The humans would not conquer the conclave or be conquered or be contained. The galaxy was large enough and life was long enough, and the conversations were just beginning. The compass was in his pocket. North was where it had always been. She knew where she was. The moment was still deciding what it was. The legal working group published its first interim report 14 months after it was formed. It was not a dramatic document. It was 47 pages of proposed revisions to conclave expansion doctrine, written in the careful language of legal architecture, full of clauses and subclauses and provisions for review. Most beings who read it would not have felt anything. It was not designed to be felt. It was designed to be correct. 3 specific provisions in it were Marcus's, traced through the working group discussions, recognizable to anyone who'd been in the room. A minimum 90-day notification window for any survey operation within 15 light-years of an inhabited system. A mandatory independent review mechanism for relocation directives before fleet deployment. And a provision that any species currently holding protected status could petition for reclassification by demonstrating functional self-governance, a process that had not previously existed in conclave law because it had never occurred to anyone to need it. The conclave's legal chamber was still arguing about the interim report. It would argue about it for another year. Several provisions would be modified. Some would be dropped. Some would survive unchanged and become part of the structure, the permanent, boring, functional structure of how the most powerful governing body in 7-star systems decided what it was. This was not HFY. This was not the moment of triumph. There was no single instant when the human stood over the fallen enemy and spoke the lines, no battlefield victory, no image that could be framed. There was a man who had noticed, his whole life, that the 3 seconds before the moment were the most important 3 seconds, and who had decided early, quietly, at some point before she'd met him, probably in a bunk on a military station after the Vega incident, maybe younger, that showing up for those 3 seconds was the thing worth doing with however long he had. There were 12,000 people on a planet called New Providence who were building a second school. There were 600 researchers at Waypoint Dusk who were collecting data on a star formation they would publish findings about in 2 years. Findings that would slightly change how everyone understood how certain types of systems formed. There was a young alien aide who had spent an afternoon learning to find misfiled precedents and who had, 6 months later, been promoted, and who was, right now, in a working group session applying a technique she'd picked up without knowing she was picking it up, looking at the law and asking who it was built around. There was a compass on a shelf. There was a woman who had burned her clearance on a message sent before she knew if it would matter, and who was sitting in a viewport-lit room with the person she'd chosen, and who was not afraid. The fleets would come again. The conclave was old and large and moved slowly, and the revision of 400 years of doctrine would take as long as it took. The working group would argue. The legal chamber would revise. The analysts would file reports with language that still didn't quite have the right category for what they were looking at. And Marcus Vale would wake up and get coffee, and hum something that started and stopped and started again, and notice what was broken and fix it, and show up for the 3 seconds before the moment with the patience of a man who understood that the moment was a choice that both parties were still making, and the choice was always available, and it was worth offering, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, often enough to matter, the other party chose it too. Veltharis of the Conclave's 3rd Diplomatic Integration Office, formerly of the 3rd Diplomatic Tier, watched him from across the room and thought, this is what it looks like. Not victory, not dominance, not the thing the analysts keep trying to name. This, the morning, the coffee, the compass pointing north. The conversation still open. She said, Marcus. He looked up. She said, there's a session at 9. The notification window provision is being challenged. He nodded, set down the coffee, picked up the compass, the small gesture she'd seen 100 times, the brief weight of it in his hand, the check that it was still there. He said, "Ready when you are." She stood, she was. They went,